passion of yours? Did you study writing in college? Did you always want to be a novelist?
My parents tell a story that when I was about 6 years old, someone asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, and then I said I wanted to be an old man who lived at the top of a mountain giving advice.
So you achieved it.
Now, if that's true, and my parents are liars, then that was another plan I had. But I don't remember a time when I didn't want to be a writer. I thought it was a glorious thing to do, and I studied writing a little bit in college. I went to a college that didn't have a big creative writing program, but I studied a lot of books, and I thought about them and began writing, and it was always something that I wanted to do, was to be in the company of literature in one way or another. It seemed to me the place to be. That's why I like to do things like come to a book festival where I feel I'm among comrades who also feel that way, who feel the slight alienation day in and day out. Brought to you by the ordinary world, who wish we were all reading instead. Maybe we should all just pick up books now.
Even in Los Angeles, thousands of people come out.
You know, I think Los Angeles has a complex about apologizing for its book society. There's many authors here who produce glorious works, and many people who come to see them and buy the books, and all of them say, even for Los Angeles, you must admit we're doing fine.
You're in California to secede and split California into 5 separate states, one of which would just be called Silicon Valley.
I think it's 6. Anyway, it's too many.
It's a terrible idea.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't understand a thing about the United States, frankly. And I say that as someone who was born in the United States. I'm not, you know, one of those, I do not understand your America. But I never understand the whole notion of the United States. It seems strange to me.
It's a convention, I think.
Something, yeah. We fought for it, and then, I don't know, it's complicated. But yes, I always wanted to be a writer.
And now here you are. How did you come to write books for children?
By accident, I guess. The first novel I wrote that was at all suitable for publication, depending on how you look at it, is The Basic 8, and it is the story of a girl in high school who has a crush on a boy who is not interested in her, and so she bludgeons him to death with a croquet mallet. It's a comedy. And it took a long time to get that novel published. And in desperation, my literary agent sent it to a couple of editors at children's publishing houses. It was so long ago. I'm thinking about this because The Basic 8, which is still in print, but there's talk of it being kind of packaged for the young adult market, which is hilarious to me because it was rejected from the young adult market for the exact same things that it's now wants to be repackaged for. So I met with various children's editors who said that there are teenagers in this book who, what's the word I'm looking for, drink, and have sex, and ingest absinthe, which at the time seemed different from drinking. Which I love that those were the complaints because I mentioned earlier, and bludgeon each other to death, which I think most people would agree is worse. But no one was concerned about that. They said the teenagers in these books do this, and so we could not possibly publish it for young adults. And now they say, thank goodness this book has this, otherwise we could not publish it for young adults. The book, I don't know if the book is for young adults really because it's about high school, but it's not necessarily for high school students. But one of the editors said, would you consider writing something that was for young people and not just about young people? And I said no, because the sort of things that I thought of, such as people bludgeoning each other with croquet mallets, I thought was inappropriate for children. And I was in fact at work on a Gothic novel that I intended to call A Series of Unfortunate Events. That was about terrible things happening over and over in a Gothic setting. And interesting is if these things were happening to children. Which is, it's just narratively more interesting, I think, right? A man falls out a window. A child falls, oh my god, how did that happen? How did a child fall out a window? But I knew in my heart that such a book would not be published for children. And then I began to think, well, it shouldn't just be one book, because the only thing more interesting than terrible things happening to children in one book would be 13 books of terrible things to children. And I began to get very embarrassed about myself because this editor had asked me to come up with an idea for children's books, and then I had the worst idea in the history of the world. And she would ask me every so often, and I was not a successful writer, to put it mildly, at the time. I was desperate and broke, and had moved to Manhattan, which is a great plan if you have no money at all. Everything's free there. And I didn't do what you're supposed to do as a professional, which is write out some kind of pitch or idea or anything, because I knew it was terrible. And I thought, well, I can't meet with her in her office and give her a pitch and then have her say, what's wrong with you? And so I called her and I said, I'll meet you in a bar, and I will tell you the idea, and then you will tell me it's terrible, and then it won't be a total loss, because we'll be in a bar, and we'll just have another drink. And like so many things that are talked about in bars, you will never talk about them again. And she said that she liked the idea, which made me very nervous because I'm sad. Because I thought to myself, she's just a lightweight. She's consumed a beverage, and the beverage has affected her chemically, and she believes that this is a good idea. And then she's going to have to call me the next day and say, I don't know what I was thinking, I'm so sorry. As women call men every morning. Under similar circumstances. I just feel obliged to say that because I know there's some young people in the audience I want to say you should never, ever, under any circumstances, at any age, consume any alcohol whatsoever. Because you will regret it. And if you talk to anyone who's consumed an alcoholic beverage, they all regret it. So the moral of the story is never do it at all. Never live your life in such a way that you regret anything. That's sound. No, but she's I'm sorry this is taking so long, this story, but it turns out she's Canadian. They drink like fish, so it hadn't affected her judgment at all, and she thought it was a good idea. And the publishing house said, they weren't that interested. They just said, well, if you guys think you can do this, best of luck to you, crazy kids. Which was a blessing. They left us entirely alone. And there was not a lot of, they hadn't paid a lot of money particularly, and I remember that the contract originally was for 4 books, and I said to my literary agent, I can't believe they're letting me write these 4 books about terrible things happening to children. She said, they're never going to publish all 4 of them, don't be ridiculous. And so I started writing them, and I just thought these are going to be complete failures. I think they're interesting, but everything I think is interesting is hopelessly obscure. All of my favorite authors, for the most part, and my favorite books are somewhat off the beaten path, and I just had no idea, and I thought for children, this is what a disastrous idea this is. And the first 2 volumes were published simultaneously, and the first place I went to talk about them was Lansing, Michigan. Do go if you have the chance. This is in the fall, too, right for the sleep season, which is just beautiful. And I was in a large chain store talking about it. One of those cavernous things that if you go to Lansing, Michigan, just a huge building. And some of these bookstores set up 10,000 folding chairs for people to see you. So even if 5,000 people came, you would feel like a failure because it's this huge room. You can't possibly fill it. And 2 people were there. And they were adults. And I didn't know what to do. And they were far away. They were way back in the back. And I wanted to say, I knew it. I'm a failure. I just wanted you to know I already knew. let's all go out. Tell me where to go in Lansing. Let's forget this whole thing. But they just sat there, and I talked about the books, and then they came up to me afterward, and they said, we are buyers from the other chain bookstore, and we are horrified by these books, and we just had to see who would do such a thing. And I remember I went back to my hotel room in Lansing, Michigan, which was every bit as lonely as you can imagine, and lay on the bed and thought, this is exactly what I thought was going to happen. I can't complain. I knew it was terrible. I told the publishing house it was terrible. They published it anyway, and I'm being told in Lansing, Michigan, it's terrible. Everything has come true. I'm a prophet. I would go and do these events, and sometimes no one would come, and every so often there would be a strange person, basically, usually a young person, who would say, I like these books very much, terrible things are happening. Will they keep happening? I said, yes, they will. Terrible things will keep happening. And turns out there were more of them than I thought.
So what was the turning point? When did you know that there would be more than? And first of all, when you started those 4 books, was it, as they appear now, the bad beginning through the miserable mill, and there was sort of an open end?
Well, I said to the publishing house, you tell me when you're going to make me stop. I would like to do 13 of them, but tell me so that I can end it in pain and suffering. And I don't think they knew if by it I meant my life. No, I'm also against suicide. And what was the turning point? I don't know. I mean, I have said before that the books just failed to fail. I thought they would be miserable and no one would be interested, and things kept happening that wasn't it was like getting a stay of execution every time. And the first time sizable numbers of people started to show up was in Canada, and that was a strange tour. I was touring kind of the northern border of the United States, so I would go to Milwaukee and no one would come, and then I would go up to Winnipeg and many people would come. And I thought, what is happening to me? I'm becoming a Canadian sensation. Which seemed lonely. Just me and men without hats, all spooning together in the tundra. Yeah, so things, I'm still astonished by it. I'm astonished by it all the time. Wherever I go, I am astonished that anyone is interested in such a thing. I always thought I would be a strange writer in whom no one took an interest, because those were the writers who I felt kinship with. And it's been very strange to me. So I've never gotten used to it, and I'm consistently befuddled and grateful.
I'm always interested in how books get, book series especially, that take off, get their sort of activation energy. And sometimes I think it's obvious, well, there was a movie, but your movie didn't come until later.
No.
And sometimes it's not obvious. There's this sort of alchemical thing that happens off stage, and you wonder, well, how the hell did that happen? And why is this happening to me?
It is strange.
It's a little.
Well, your first book was successful right away, it seems to me. But that's how it seems to everyone on the outside. Everyone says, that happened in 10 minutes, you've never suffered.
I too fully expected it to fail, and I had a long list of reasons why it should. And then I kind of thought that it did, but it sort of hung on like a bad cold. Couldn't get rid of it.
Yeah. Like a lingering disease.
Yeah. And I was like, no,
I admire that.
They're not getting better. It's a continuation. I can't see up there. I don't know if there's anyone on the balcony. Stay away from the railing.
Yeah.
This conversation gets too depressing.
Right, don't drink or kill yourself.
So you created a violent and disturbing world in which terrible things happen over and over to children, and yet children continue to read among your books. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I used to have something of an explanation, and then to my horror, I read an interview with Bill O'Reilly, and he had the same explanation for his television program. And so I thought, well, he's not correct. correct. Obviously. So obviously my logic is flawed. There's a perfect kind of reductio ad absurdum. If that's true about the world, then Bill O'Reilly is right about something. They said, well, that can't possibly be the case. Let's rethink everything. I don't know. I mean, children's literature certainly is nothing but a history of despair. I mean, the early folk tales, which we still are still among the first things we give to children, are stories of confusion and violence and reflect a world that makes no sense whatsoever. And so in that, I'm proud that the Snicket books take their place in a long parade of terrifying and misery and miserable things happening. But I also think, I can't think of a story that's interesting to me that doesn't have at least the threat of something terrible happening. And so, if someone says, something happened to me on an airplane, what you want is lightning or something in that story. And I'm not aware of, and so I think that's interesting. But I mean, there are plenty of books that have that are not being read by a large audience. So I don't really have an explanation. But I do think that, for me, what makes an interesting story is when something terrible is about to happen. I think that's interesting.
There's a difference between the threat of something terrible happening and the promise of something terrible happening over and over again, which I find fascinating.
Thank you. I'm trying to think about the difference between a threat and a promise, but that's, I remember when I had a very cranky biology teacher in high school, and he would yell at us all the time, and people would always say, is that a threat? And he would say, no, that's a promise. And I remember what, it was, if you don't ship up something, it's going to happen. I don't remember what it was. He was creepy.
My biology teacher would promise that we were going to make him have a heart attack. And
wow.
Eventually we did have a heart attack.
That's interesting to me. I am a friend of mine. Well, I went to college, and this professor killed herself while I was in college. Yes, and I had taken her for a literature class. It was also, actually, the class was called "The Sense of an Ending." I'm just gonna leave that right there. So she committed suicide in the middle of the semester, and another professor came and took the class over, and then the class got their papers back, and some of them had been corrected by the first professor, and some of them had been corrected by a second professor, and a friend of mine it was half and half, and she thought she was the moment. And she stood up and said, "I cannot take a single more moment of life."
It's very dark.
Yeah, isn't it? It's terrible. It's a terrible story. Why would one tell that?
I warned you, and it's come to pass. And I think, perhaps despite Mr. Snicket's best efforts, there's something valuable and edifying about the Snicket books that kids can take away from it, which is perhaps like a model of how to endure terrible events over and over again. And I wonder if after terrible events in the world, I actually read this online, it might have been
Must be true.
conjecture, perhaps, that after terrible events in the world, Snicket book sales uptick slightly.
Well,
therapy, perhaps.
We would have to have a period where terrible things weren't happening to test that theory, and I don't think we've come across that yet.
I'm sure there's an algorithm somewhere.
Well, I receive an enormous amount of letters from children, and a surprising number of them are children who have lost more than one parent. An audience that I thought would perhaps not appreciate these books, and in fact appreciates them very much. So I can understand that a little bit, because it is the story, as anyone knows who's had a death of someone close to them, and I hadn't when I began these books, but I have since, and you know the feeling of, on one hand it's okay, and on the other hand it will never be okay. That you are constantly missing this person, and yet it doesn't mean that you won't find something delicious or funny, or that you won't have joy in your life, or that you still have responsibility to do things. This is something that was shown to me at a young age because my father left Germany in a hurry in 1939. You'll never guess why. And some of my father's family had the foresight to leave and escape Nazis, and some of them didn't. And so some of them lived and some of them died. And the story of their survival and loss was was a series of unfortunate events. It was random. It was not a sense that some of them behaved well or were smarter or were braver or any of that is in tedious children's books. There was only the sense that catastrophe can strike you at any time. And I think children who have lost parents also have that sense. They have a very keen sense that it didn't happen because of something that they did or that someone else did. They may have that anxiety, but they really have a sense of you can come home one day and have the worst news.
Mm-hmm. There's a sort of a sense in your books, I think, of like a looming, inevitable chaos, sort of black cloud following everyone, but like only the children are really aware of it. You know, Mr. Poe is being followed by a black cloud too, but he seems blissfully unaware of it. Yeah, I don't like to use my son as an example very often. I mean, at home I do, but not in public. But he, at a very young age, he and I had a conversation about death because his great-grandfather, who he had the luck to have, died just about right in front of him. And we've said this is the thing that happens when you get very old, and it was a thing that we hadn't thought of explaining to him right then, but then we had to because he wasn't around. And then later that same summer, my son was running on a pier and he was about to jump into this water, and when you have a child, a small child, of course it's nothing but those moments over and over again. Oh my God! And so I grabbed him right before he got into the water, which would have been a disaster. And I was wearing a very nice suit. What was I supposed to do? No. It would have been a disaster. And he said, what would happen if I went in there? And I said, you could die. You have to be very careful. And then we were listening to some music by Grant McLennan of the Go-Betweens, a wonderful musician who died suddenly. And my son, because we know a bunch of musicians, my son said, oh, do we know Grant McLennan? Is he going to come over to our house? And I said, no, he's not going to come over to our house. He died. My son said, was he really old? And I said, no. And he said, was he not careful? And I said, no. And I thought, well, here we are at the mystery of the entire universe, you know, and I used the first two excuses. This isn't something that happens forever. You don't have to worry about this. And then, oh, well, actually you do. You have to do certain things to avoid dying. And then I thought, or not. Sometimes it just happens. Good night. But I think, I mean, for me it was a very simple three-step process with my son, but I think in many ways that's the question that we are wrestling with.